We stand at a perilous moment in our fight against climate change. Global leaders are converging in Glasgow, Scotland for a major UN climate conference known as COP26. The commitment shown by world leaders at this conference and the actions taken by individual countries could well determine the fate of our planet and the billions of people and species who call it home. Governments won't be acting alone. At Glasgow, we will see representatives from every sector of society, and every sector has a role to play, and most particularly the business sector. Simply put, we need to cut global emissions in half by 2030, and we can't get there without the private sector and the innovation and the capital and the partnerships that they bring to this challenge. So, welcome to Companies for Climate Action, a series of conversations between World Wildlife Fund and some of the world's top business leaders about the urgent need to solve the climate crisis. We hope this series sends a clear signal that business leaders are putting skin in the game to slash emissions at a scale that matters, and more importantly, that they are demanding commitments at COP26 and here at home in the United States that put our planet on a path to a livable future. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, and welcome to today's conversation. I'm Carter Roberts from World Wildlife Fund, and joining me today is someone who has brought real energy and commitment to the climate fight in recent years, Chris Kempczinski, President and CEO of McDonald's. Chris, your restaurants operate in more than 100 countries around the world, all embedded in communities, and feed millions of people every day. Your supply chain reaches farms, ranches, and businesses of many sizes in hundreds of thousands of communities around the world. As CEO of McDonald's, why does a stable climate and intact nature matter to the institution you lead? And what are the most important commitments you've made, and what are your biggest engines for delivering on those commitments?
Well, first, Carter, thanks for having me here. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be talking about McDonald's and how we're trying to play our part in solving the global climate crisis. I think for us, if you think about our business is inherently tied to this planet. We're in the business of serving people food, but we serve about 65 million people a day. And the food that we serve comes from ranchers and farmers around the world that support our business. And so if you think about that as the nature of what we do, having this planet be able to continue to provide and nourish the billions of people that live on it is foundational to our business. So from a first standpoint, because we're in the food business, we are so attached to what's going on with climate and making sure that we continue to make this planet a planet that can support life all around the world. I think beyond that, though, for us, there's an obligation as a company, and we talk about our purpose being to feed and foster communities. Well, a big part of what is impacting communities around the world right now is climate change, and you're seeing that manifest itself in all different sorts of ways. And so for us, part of stepping up on climate is it's also part of our commitment to being there for communities to make sure that those communities can continue to be sustainable. We've been on this journey for a number of years, going back maybe 4 or 5 years ago when we first signed on and aligned with the Paris Treaty and committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions in line with the Paris Treaty. And now upcoming with COP26 just around the corner, for us, an important thing leading up to that was our net zero commitment and committing to get to net zero by 2050. And doing it across the entire ecosystem that is McDonald's, not just the emissions that we have, but extending all the way out to our Scope 3 emissions, because that is a huge part of where we have emissions. It's with our suppliers, it's how we raise and produce the food that we do. So for this is an all hands on deck commitment by the company. It's something we believe in very importantly, not just because we're in the food business, but also because of our commitment to our communities.
We've spoken several times about the importance of science-based targets. And for those who don't know, science-based targets are a a methodology of taking the Paris Agreement, parsing what each sector in the world needs to deliver against that, and the implications for companies like McDonald's. And they are peer reviewed, they are science reviewed, and they are reported on transparently over time. And there are now upwards of 1,000 companies that have committed to science-based targets. McDonald's was one of the very first. And in some ways, the science around science-based targets is still evolving. And some of the things, Chris, you've talked about are easier than others. And I just wanted to ask you, what have you learned at McDonald's in the process of setting science-based targets? And what are the unique challenges for McDonald's in delivering against them, particularly in areas where the science or the technologies or the policies aren't quite there yet?
Well, I just want to thank WWF for really championing this approach on science-based targets. We believe it is so important and foundational that everybody is on the same scorecard using science-based targets to make sure that we're making progress on this. So thank you for your leadership in that. And as you said, we are fully committed to that. It's how we look at everything through the science-based target lens. I think for us, one of the things that's a challenge on this is because it involves so many different people. This is not a problem that McDonald's is going to be able to solve on its own. This is going to be something that certainly companies like us need to be a part of, but we also need governments to step up with actions. I believe that we need very specific things around how we're going to have a price on carbon. And so all of these things become part of solving the Rubik's Cube of going after greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately on climate change. But for us as a company, many of the things that we need to happen are going to require innovation that maybe doesn't exist out there in the industry today. And so as we set this ambition of being at net zero by 2050 and using science-based targets to measure our progress, we also need to make sure that we continue to have the innovations out there that can help us on this journey. And again, this is not something that McDonald's is going to be able to solve on its own, but we're committed that we want to be part of the solution. And we look forward to working with organizations like yourself, others, and governments so that we can all solve this together.
So, Chris, I want to talk about governments and the role they play, and I want to talk about policy. But first, I want to talk about some of the things that are unique to McDonald's that you and I've talked about that represent both a big part of your footprint, but also a big part of the opportunity. And one of them is, of course, your restaurants, the real estate you have, the restaurants you have, your ability not only to change the way they operate, but to reach consumers. But the one that looms biggest probably in people's minds is beef. And as the world studies more and more of the biggest drivers of greenhouse gas emissions, and identifies what are the biggest imperatives and opportunities for change, food looms large for many reasons. And among food, one of the biggest drivers in the world of agriculture is beef, both the inputs to beef and the outputs of beef. And, I know, having spent a lot of time with McDonald's, that you actually sell more chicken than beef these days, but still beef is a consequential part of your operations and also your carbon footprint. And could you just talk about the kind of approaches you're taking to evolve your menu, but also to invent new approaches to beef to reduce your footprint?
Well, it starts with, I do think that there are ways for us working with our ranchers to make beef a less carbon intensive protein out there. And I'm proud of our participation as one of the founding members on the Global Beef Sustainability Roundtable. And quite simply, the idea was, how do we think about the assets that a cattle rancher has? Yes, they have cattle, but they also have a tremendous amount of land that can act as a carbon sink. And so as you think about using that land and finding ways through regenerative farming to actually be able to take carbon out of the atmosphere at the same time that they're raising cattle, I think those are the types of ideas that we can be working with our ranchers on to make beef less of a contributor to the overall carbon emissions that we have globally. At the same time, as you mentioned, there are other proteins out there, chicken being one, fish being another one, plant-based being a third, that offer different ways for consumers to enjoy McDonald's and that have less of an impact on climate emissions. And so for us, we are always about offering the customers choice. Chicken, as you mentioned, is a big part of our global menu. We sell a lot of chicken, but we're also committed to plant-based, and we've started doing that in different markets around the world. I've always said that we will go as fast as the customer wants to take us on plant-based. Ultimately, that's the business that we're in, is meeting the needs of customers. And I think the thing that I'm proud of that we've done there as well is we've made sure today that even though plant-based is a more expensive source of protein than beef or chicken, we're selling it at parity pricing. So we're trying to do the types of things to nudge consumers to allow them to make these choices. But I'd start back where I began, which is we also think there are a number of things that we can do to make beef an even more sustainable part and still have beef consumption out there, but do it in a way that's friendlier on the planet.
There are other interesting issues that arise in the world of climate change, and particularly supply chains and companies, as they work through scope 1, 2, and 3 in their commitments, all the way from their own operations through their supply chains. And the beauty of science-based targets for us is it sets the goal for companies to own their own footprint and to grind away at reducing it through scope 1, 2, and 3. And we also know that as companies move on fulfilling those responsibilities, there are moments in time when a company can't get all the way, either because of capital investments or because of what it means to actually move a difference in operations across so many restaurants, across so many suppliers, and that there is an additional opportunity for companies to take action to address gaps that have not yet been closed, what we call residual emissions, and to do so not as offsets per se, but as credits. And one of the more interesting solutions is to assist nations and communities in conserving nature, and in so doing, to reduce the emissions that come with the destruction of nature. There's a lot of controversy in this space, with real concern about the integrity of supply and making sure that those actions on the ground actually last and they deliver real emissions reductions, but also, real concern on integrity of demand, that companies don't do this as a way of avoiding the responsibility of reducing emissions within their own operations. But all that being said, this is a red hot area. And as we go into Glasgow, there are lots of companies and players that are interested in this. So just a question for you: how do you as a company think about navigating these possibilities and maintain the integrity that you have had from the very, very beginning of all of our work with you?
Well, listen, we're not going to offset our way to success on the climate issue for McDonald's or globally. And so while offsets may play a role, it ultimately goes to what you were talking about, Carter, which is we have to find ways, working with all the different parts of the McDonald's system, our suppliers, our franchisees, company employees, that we can actually reduce our carbon emissions. And again, much of that sits in what you would describe as scope 3 emissions. But I would tell you that as we have conversations with our suppliers, there's a lot of very creative ideas that I'm hearing and seeing out there that I get excited about and confident that they've starting to put the pieces together of how do we go after this. And part of what we've tried to do is to make sure that we are very clear about our support so that they are willing to make those investments to be able to provide us products that are more sustainably sourced, that have a much lower emissions footprint. I think the other thing that goes with all of this is how do we make sure that as some of the costs are perhaps higher for making these areas, that it also doesn't put people at a disadvantage. And that's why I've been talking about the need for there also to be a government layer here where it's a level playing field. And you can't have companies doing the right thing, but it's putting them at a competitive disadvantage. We need government policymakers to ensure that as companies like McDonald's lead in this place, in this area, that we're also able to fulfill our needs of making sure we have a sustainable business. And so there's a lot of different actors on this, but I guess I'd just go back to saying offsets cannot be the way forward on this. We've got to find real ways to take our carbon emissions down across the system. I'm encouraged with what we're seeing with suppliers. But this is going to be, as you said, grinding it out. And Ray Kroc wrote a book called Grinding It Out when he founded McDonald's. So that's right in our wheelhouse.
I've always said life is about execution, and setting goals that are ambitious drive innovation. They drive people to think about things in a different way, and they drive them to do so with all their partners and their suppliers, which is what you're doing. To me, one of the most interesting spaces in all of the climate world is food. 70% of the water that's used on the planet used to grow food. The greatest form of habitat destruction comes from unsustainable food production, which is why pursuing sustainability matters so much. And Chris, you just raised the simple fact that the greatest impacts come from those companies who haven't set goals, who aren't necessarily following government regulations that need to be enforced. And there is a really important role for governments to play, both in making commitments, but also setting in place the policies, the regulatory frameworks for progressive companies to move faster, but also to bring up the companies who aren't moving at all. So we're pre-taping this interview in the lead up to the UN Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26 in Glasgow. This year's COP is going to bring together governments from around the world on looking at the future of our planet and setting goals and negotiating toward a net zero future, but also in their own way, it has to be backed up by policies and regulatory frameworks at home. So that includes the US. So can you just talk a little bit more about the role of business in engaging with governments and getting to where we need to go, and the significance of COPs like Glasgow, and why you and I will both be there. And let me just add one more thing. The message you most want to deliver to those gathered there, whether it's US policymakers or country negotiators who will be in Scotland in just a few weeks.
Yep. I think it starts with, they call it tone at the top, but the message that I, as CEO, deliver on behalf of the corporation, and I think we have been very, very consistent on this for several years, which is that we view climate as a real issue. It is a business issue. It is also a moral issue. And it's an issue that McDonald's wants to be part of the solution. So anytime I have a conversation with government, whether it's at state or federal level, I make sure that they understand the seriousness of this issue, and that McDonald's is doing a number of things to contribute to it. But I also, in the same breath, tell them that we are going to be stymied. We are not going to be able to fulfill our ambition if we're trying to do it alone. If it's left to private actors like McDonald's, private companies, to solve this, we are not going to solve this. This is, in the economist language, this is a classic externality that has to get solved through a legislative framework, which is what we're trying to get done with COP26. And I think it's just, there's an increasing recognition across the world around a number of big companies, but I think also, as you're seeing just the general public, that this is going to require some creativity, but also some courage from policymakers. And that's ultimately what I see COP26 as being all about, ensuring that, with our participation there, that they're hearing from us our support for it, but also helping to maybe give people the courage to make the step, to make the commitments that are going to be necessary for us to ensure we keep, climate warming, global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and no more, because the consequences of going beyond that are just so dire not just for McDonald's business, but for the planet at large.
Amen. So there is this beyond partnership with other companies, of which you have many, but also the engagement with government. There is this emerging series of partnerships with NGOs like WWF, and I'd love to get your perspective on how our partnership and other partnerships you develop help you feel confident about making the commitments that you've made to a net zero future.
Yeah. Well, I view WWF and say there's just a few other organizations that we kind of hold in the same at the same level, but you are truth tellers. You are the ones that are closest to the science and can help interpret what the latest and greatest science is and put it into real tangible actions that company like McDonald's can take. And so I think you guys play a very important bridge between the policy and sort of the science world, but actually being able to apply it and get it into company policy, legislative policy, et cetera. So for us, it's a great partnership. And I think, you guys are very balanced about calling out where we have an opportunity to do more, and you can give us specific examples. If you see someone else who's doing something, that's a great use to us, and also tell us how we're doing relative to others and how where are the areas that we can lead. So all of this is about knowledge sharing, and you guys are a key part of that, and I thank you guys for the engagement.
There are, of course, it's our partnership with you and other companies is enormously important to us for the reasons you've mentioned. And also, when governments put in place regulatory frameworks, they listen to leading businesses and the kind of innovations they can make and the kind of regulatory framework they need. But it is true in both with science-based targets and with climate change, the facts will speak for themselves. And I've often said, it's a lot like sports. At the end of the day, the score is the score, the time is the time. And Chris, you and my oldest son have one thing in common, which is my oldest son captained his cross-country team in high school. And I know you are devoted to running and to running marathons. And I've had front row seats to the fact that at the end of a race, the times are what they are. And to get there and to compete successfully takes extreme discipline and a mindset to get ready for races, a strategy for races, and then just the endurance to gut it out, to deliver on what sometimes seems like an impossible thing. And I just want to close by asking you how your experience with running, and particularly races, and particularly marathons, translates into the mindset we need to tackle this seemingly impossible challenge for us all.
Yeah. Well, it's a great metaphor that you just were touching on, which is this is not something that just became a problem yesterday or even 10 years ago. This has been something that's been going on for quite a while, and the solution is going to take a multi-decade commitment. It's why you're hearing people talk about 2040, 2050 net zero commitments. This is a long-term grind. This is a long-term marathon that we are on, and it is going to require resilience. We are all going to hit the wall. There's going to be a moment where we don't think we can go any further, and we know the finish line is maybe another 6-7 miles away, and we're just going to have to find a way. And I think that's, for me, a big part of what running marathons is about. It's don't let the rational part of you tell you stop. It's about emotion, and it's about how badly do you want it. And I think in the case of climate, failure is not an option. And that's a pretty powerful motivator, because we can't afford to fail on this. And so for us, you're right, ultimately the scorecard is going to be the legacy that we leave to the planet. If we can contain the rise of temperatures and make sure that, to finish off with your metaphor here, we can't have any Rosie Ruizes out there. No cheating. You got to do this the right way. And this is going to be something that's going to take sustained effort.
For those of you who are listening to this interview series, Rosie Ruiz was an individual in the Boston Marathon who disappeared in the middle of the race, jumped into a subway, took it near the end of the race, and somehow exceeded all expectations. And the world is creating the right kind of monitoring, truth-telling, feedback to make sure that doesn't happen. Hey, Chris, I wanted to thank you for your leadership in moving McDonald's. It's an organization, an institution that touches down in so many communities, so many nations, and to move your many restaurants and your employees and your suppliers, and ultimately really to move governments to do the right thing matters a lot. And the goal of this interview series is to send a signal to negotiators meeting at COP26. But we also are going to tee this up to make sure that your voice and your example reaches many, many, many other people. And I know, as we talked about it, some of those people are the very people who come to your restaurants, and they're going to learn more about how you source food, how you deliver food, and the story of food and the story of your business through the lens of sustainability and climate change and what you're doing about that. So I wanted to thank you for your leadership and also for your example and for taking the time to do this with me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to our viewers, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, the first of many. And please be sure to tune in to the rest of the interview series that we have.